Hi, I'm Elizabeth Rodriguez, and this is a webinar on long-range transportation planning and long-range transportation plans, LRTPs. I am a transportation planner. I have a master's in urban and regional planning and about 30 years of really varied experience in the field. I've worked for both the private and public sectors and worked on long-range transportation plans again, from the public sector perspective and also as a consultant doing long-range transportation plans for various MPOs. Um, right now, I am working for myself and doing traffic studies, and I'm pleased to be able to present you this webinar. So, just right off the bat, a long range transportation plan, LRTP for short, um, is a plan for usually a 20-year horizon to include all of the transportation improvements needed within that horizon year. This would include both roadway improvements as well as transit improvements. And when somebody tells you that they're working on an LRTP, often, well, actually, usually, they're working on an LRTP update. The original LRTP was probably done some time ago, and we'll get into the history in a little bit, but the original LRTP was probably done some time ago, and they're updating it as is federally mandated on a regular basis. Futurama. Um, for those of you who are into cartoons, you know that Futurama is a cartoon. But before Futurama was a cartoon, it was the name of 1939 expo that General Motors put together for the World's Fair. What does this have to do with the LRTPs? Need to sign up for my webinar and you're going to find out it's actually a really, really interesting connection and kind of a direct connection. We're going to be able to connect the dots from Futurama. Let me click forward a little bit here. Here's another part. It was a heck of a detailed exhibition that they put on for this World Fair. We're going to be able to connect the dots um, from this exposition to some highway bills to the advent of the interstate system and future or forward to MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, and on to LRTPs. And it's pretty interesting because, we had always, the conventional wisdom has been that the interstate system was built um, as part of, Eisenhower's initiative to have, for evacuation of the cities as a kind of a civil defense measure during, the Cold War. But, that was probably kind of part of the rationale, but there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, and it's really interesting. Um, why, you may ask, are we going to kind of start off the longer webinar with this history lesson? And here's the answer. I feel that it is just absolutely imperative to understand the history of LRTPs and MPOs because everything didn't happen all at once. In other words, the LRTP that you see today with the cost feasible portion, again, we're going to get to that, and the MPOs and the way they're set up, that didn't happen all at once. It evolved, and I'm going to show you how it evolved. And more importantly, I'm going to show you why it evolved because um, the um, the way that you see it today, it's going to appear that there's just all kinds of, red tape, and that it's very, a big process these updates that take a lot of time, but we're going to see why each piece of the puzzle is there, because we really need to understand that, because otherwise there would really be a temptation to like get rid of big swaths of it. But we're going to see what was going on in the United States as each puzzle piece was put into place so that we understand why the setup is the way it is today. So here's a really abbreviated version where we talk about, the 50s. I had alluded to Eisenhower earlier, and, things were very optimistic. And I say, we had enthusiastic suburbanization. And then there was actually a book that we're not going to dive too deeply into, but it was called The Crack in the Picture Window. And a picture window was something that you had in all the suburban houses, and maybe a little crack was starting to form. And that's a metaphor for, with this enthusiastic suburbanization of the 50s, we just started to see maybe a few problems. And then, we're going to fast forward to the early 70s, and by now you have all kinds of issues in the cities, and there's even a civil rights aspect to LRTPs that we're going to learn about. There's, the Pollution and Clean Air Act and all that kind of stuff, was kind of, all that stuff was kind of starting to gel by now. And you'll see also the second bullet about the Arab oil embargo of the 70s. So the 70s, the Highway Act of 1973 created and funded the first MPOs. So an MPO is a metropolitan planning organization. Every metro area with 50,000 or more people has to have an MPO. And I'm going to say MPO interchangeably. Sometimes they're called TPOs or councils of government, but we're not going to kind of dissect that. We're just going to, if I say MPO, I'm also referring to those. So once we get through kind of like the history of the MPO and the LRTP so that we really understand why we are where we are, then our second part of our webinar is going to be about the model. So the model is not the same model, nationwide. And that's my first point I want to make in just this kind of brief preview. The second point I want to make is that this is not a modeling webinar. If you want to become a modeler and join that elite priesthood or priestesshood, you're going to take modeling classes, and this is not that. This is going to be an explanation of the model for non-modelers so that they understand what the modelers are doing, or it's going to be an intro to where you're going to become interested in the model, and then maybe you are going to go take those modeling classes. Um, Now, in Florida, just as an example, there's a standard model, and there's a standard model in a lot of other parts of the country, and you would just need to look into this for your particular part of the country. Um, and then the standard model has kind of evolved over time. And I told you I had 30 years of experience, so I remember when it was done on a mainframe in Tallahassee, and then, we got everything, you know, plan based, and we were able to do it on a PC. And I was the modeler, a couple places where I worked, and you would have to run the model all night. That's how long it took, and come a long way, baby. So once we kind of go over the model, we're going to talk about, okay, how does that modeling is a component in an LRTP, long range transportation plan update. How does that integrate into this whole update process? Where does that puzzle piece fit in? And then we're going to, just talk about the whole puzzle, and all the pieces. So these are just some sample steps where you would develop a schedule. You need a public involvement plan. We'll talk about that. It's crucial. Um, Update the model and the model calibration. The next couple of steps is that whole modeling arena is kind of going on. And some of the stuff is going on concurrently. In other words, you've got the public involvement kind of cooking while the modeling's going on. Um, the the model runs are going to lead to the development of a needs plan. Um, and then a separate consultant is usually developing a financial plan. That is going to be, it's first of all, it's very specialized. It's not the same consultants. And then secondly, the financial plan is projections about how much money is going to be available for all these transportation improvements. So through the needs plan, we're going to identify the needed improvements to the transportation system within some timeline. Let's just call it a 20-year horizon. And that's going to be roadway and transit improvements. So the financial plan is going to tell you how much money is available for that needs plan, which some people refer to as a wish list. Okay, so then that kind of feeds nicely down to the next bullet point, derive cost feasible plan. So what happens there is you've got your wish list. It's like life in general, right? You've got your wish list, but then you've got your budget. And so you're going to come up with a subset of your needs plan or your wish list, which is your cost feasible plan. Okay, here's all the needed, improvements. Here's our budget, and then here's the subset of which what is actually, sometimes it's called the cost affordable plan. It's what we can afford. And then part of that, as you're creating that cost affordable plan, you're actually putting the um, the projects themselves into priority order, but then you kind of tighten that up and prioritize the cost feasible plan, and then that helps you figure out, okay, maybe in the next 5 years these projects need to get done, and then within a 10-year time span, the next subset and so forth. So this is just very broad brush. Again, we're just doing a preview, but we're going to dive deeper and learn more about these steps. And again, this is going to be useful for somebody that actually is going to work on LRTPs. They're going to need to do, more learning and more research afterwards, but it's going to give you a real basic idea. But it's also going to be useful for somebody that is maybe doing, road design or working for a county or city, or somebody that's working in land development, because as you're going to see, and as we continue on, we're going to talk about the ways that the LRTP uh, kind of affects and is affected by a whole lot of other types of, planning and engineering documents and processes. So even if you are going to work directly on LRTPs, great. But even if you're not going to, and your work is going to bump up against them, this is going to be a great overview, because you're going to understand, what goes into these things and what comes out of these things, and some of the caveats and limitations, of especially of the output, and you're going to know enough to be dangerous. Let's keep moving here. Okay, so as I said, we're going to learn how the long range plan, the comprehensive plan, uh, and the zoning and land development codes are related. So this is a crazy little flow chart I put together. These circles are the various elements, or they might be called chapters in your particular state or county, of a comprehensive plan. So, when we actually start to explore this in the larger webinar, we're going to understand how is the transportation element of your comprehensive plan related to the LRTP, and vice versa. How does, the findings and results of your LRTP then influence the transportation element or chapter of your comp plan? Um, this is really interesting. You've got usually a future land use element or chapter or some type of a land use chapter to your comprehensive plan. Let's follow this arrow around. Here we go. So that influences and is influenced by the LRTP. How? Well, how do we project um, the future needs for the transportation system? It's driven by land use. Let's keep moving here. Okay, it's driven by land use. So this graphic, this is a comic graphic. This is like a little more detailed than you commonly see, but this graphic talks about the fact, and this is how it's usually used, and I'm going to put a little twist on it, but how it's usually used is to explain to people, look, you've got, a semi built up area and you've got a lot of traffic, and so you need to widen your road from, say, 2 to 4 lanes. You do that and you've got extra capacity. Now more people can build. So the land use increases to the point where there's too much traffic, and now you have to go from 4 to 6 lanes. That creates so-called excess capacity, and now people can rush in and build some more. And now maybe you need an 8 lane road. And so it's what some would call a vicious cycle. So that's what this graphic is usually used for, but I am also going to just use it to kind of explain about the relationship between an LRTP and the future land use element or section or chapter of a comp plan. The land use projections drive the model. So in other words, if land use projections in a given area are showing a whole lot of growth, those projections are actually entered into the model as socioeconomic data, or sometimes called Z data, which is for zonal data. Those projections are entered into the model. And so a need is shown for roadway or transit capacity going out to our sample area. So in that way, those projections drive the model. But the reverse is true too, because once that money is allocated to, provide that roadway or transit capacity to the area, and this is where our cycle comes in. And once that capacity is created, it is going to open up that that area and make it much more attractive, because now if that was, say, a far-flung suburban area and you've just built, an expressway out to it, the travel times to, the business district or districts have decreased, and now that area is more attractive to people and it can be developed. So the socioeconomic and land use data drives the model, but the model results in the resultant transportation improvement can actually make it kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you've made the area more attractive, and the your forecasts come true. Um, so just to summarize briefly, this is going to be an LRTP webinar, and we're going to learn the history of LRTPs and why that's important and why we are where we are. We're going to learn the basics of the model, but we're not going to learn to run the various state and regional models. We're going to learn the steps of LRTP, of executing a long-range transportation plan update. And we're going to spend a lot of time understanding the connections between LRTPs, developing design traffic, working on PD&E studies, um, and even working on like a site impact analysis, that type of work for developers. I'm doing a lot of that now. And how does that affect LRTP updates and how is that affected by LRTP updates. So I hope you join me. Should be interesting and looking forward to it. Thank you very much.